The Bay of Pigs invasion is perhaps one of the most memorable failures of foreign policy in the United States during the Cold War. After Eisenhower left office, the plans were still there, and the Kennedy administration, without questioning anything, decided to go along with the plans that ultimately led to one of the greatest failures during his administration. The Bay of Pigs invasion reminds us of today's quotation by Canadian hockey player Sidney Crosby. It says, "I play for the logo on the front, not the name on the back." We ultimately interpret this quotation to mean that the organization or group that someone belongs to is more important than the individual himself. But we ultimately disagree with this quotation in its entirety, because while the group is important, while the group that they belong to is great, the individual needs of someone are far more important. And we'll look at a couple of reasons why. First, when we're in a group, groupthink happens, and that becomes very dangerous. And second, our individuality is what leads to change. But first, we have to understand that when we are in a group, that's where groupthink begins to happen, and that's where we see the most dangers. A group is important. A team is important. Having that dynamic is great. But individuals need to be heard, and that's something that doesn't always happen. And we'll look at a couple of examples here. First is Basta from the Ink Heart trilogy by Cornelia Funke. Basta is someone who decides to follow without questioning the authority of the leaders that are the bad guys within that entire trilogy, Capricorn and Mortola. Basta continually follows them and their orders without even thinking twice. And in the second book in the trilogy, Basta actually dies by following the orders that Mortola has given him. Basta is the perfect example of someone who chose to blindly follow their organization or their group and ultimately saw how dangerous that is. But we also see this in the business world all the time with companies. Specifically, let's look at Swiss Air. Swiss Air was known as the flying bank. They were almost untouchable. But their chief executives and their board of directors thought that they were somehow invulnerable to anything. And ultimately, the company had gross mismanagement and had to file for bankruptcy. Because the group of executives within Swiss Air chose to ignore the issues of mismanagement, chose to ignore the issues going on within the company, they fell into groupthink. They were more focused on the organization and the company as a whole, rather than listening to the individuals who were speaking out. Whether it's Basta from the Ink Heart trilogy or Swiss Air, the company, we find that groupthink is dangerous because it refuses to allow individuality to happen. But it's through that individuality that we see change happening. And that's what's really important to recognize today. When we decide to focus not on the group, but ourselves, and listen to people within the group, individuality can flourish. We'll look at a couple of examples here. First and foremost, looking at the fact that individuality can lead to change, we'll look at a congresswoman from Missouri, Cori Bush. In 2018, she ran against Lacy Clay, the incumbent at the time. Now, while he won in 2018, she was taught an important lesson, that the establishment, the group of leaders within the Democratic Party, didn't think that progressives should challenge incumbents, even in safe Democratic districts. She didn't listen, and 2 years later she ran and won in the primary and is now the first African-American congresswoman from the state of Missouri. Cori Bush is a wonderful example of someone who chose to pursue not the group, who chose to go along not with the logo, but with her own individual ideas. But we also see this in the movie Baby Boom with the character J.C. Wyatt. J.C. Wyatt, played by Diane Keaton, is the head of a huge company firm that focuses on management and advertising for big businesses. Now, she decides to go along with the group and decides to focus solely on the company itself rather than her own individual goals throughout the first part of the movie. Then a baby literally lands in her apartment and she's forced to reevaluate. She chooses to create her own company and turns away from the business world. Her individuality led to massive change in her life. She moved out of the big city and into the countryside in the state of Maine. Whether it's J.C. Wyatt or Corey Bush, we see that when individuality flourishes, it's far better for the group as a whole. At the end of the day, when we look at Sidney Crosby's quotation, "I promise to play for the logo" on the front, not the name on the back, we interpret this quotation to mean that the group is more important than the individual. But we flat out disagreed for two key reasons. First, it leads to groupthink, and that's dangerous. And individuality is what leads to real change. At the end of the day, the Kennedy administration definitely would have benefited from some more individuality of thought before the Bay of Pigs invasion. They didn't. They chose to focus on the group as a whole, and they failed.